I didn't think much about it initially until I saw another one of my neighbors put their Harris sign up. And literally, there's like only 3 houses by us. You have to go out of the way to see all of this. And I'm just like, oh, this is strange. There's no one to see these signs except for me. Like, who are they trying to, I mean, it's okay to promote your political candidate, but are they trying to get to my wife? My kids aren't even old enough to vote. I mean, a little old me. Well, if you haven't been joining us for the past couple of weeks, today we're putting a bow on our mini-series, Breaking Points, when religion and politics collide. Last week, Pastor Joshua at Grace Chapel spoke into just some of the tension and the difficulties around relationships. And today we're going to take that another step. Well, chances are if you are a peacemaker or you consider yourself a peacemaker by personality like me, that you'd rather put a hot topic like this aside. I get that. Politics at its root is also something that's supposed to be good for the world. It simply describes the affairs of the city. And isn't that something that we would all want to be conducted well? And although the gospel, the message of Jesus, isn't something that's partisan, the gospel in its very nature, as we're going to see soon, it is political. As much as we might like to separate the two, it says something important about the what, the how, and the who of power, which we will get to shortly. At the same time, it feels more difficult to move in the same direction, doesn't it? To be productive, to find common ground. The result of that is not only a fallout between people who follow Jesus and people who don't follow Jesus, it's also had consequences, has had consequences on relationships within the church. Who don't you see anymore because of the current political divide that we are facing? It's not just relationships. It seems like we have increasingly faced differing visions for the country, and none of them without their challenges. Politics may be good for the country, but what happens when politics go bad? And what happens when the political outlook is not so good either? Well, it turns out there's reasons for concern. 72% of people reported stress over the upcoming presidential election. 72% of people. The stakes feel so high this time that the chances are after the election, that political tension, it's not just going to disappear. It's not going to go away. So what we're going to talk about today, it's important because there are certain things about the election that are in our control, and then there are certain things about the election that are not in our control. But if our political building hinges on immediate outcomes only, we may miss an opportunity to shape not just an electorate, but to shape a generation. So, how can we ensure we are building better politics today, regardless of who wins the election tomorrow? That's the question that I want to explore with you all today. And to do that, I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach than I usually do, and I'm just going to kind of come out with some clear points right away, right at the front. Number one, weigh our political thoughts. We can build a better future tomorrow, a better political future tomorrow, regardless of who wins the election, by weighing our political thoughts today. And more specifically, weighing our political thoughts regarding our values, our approaches, our character, and our strategies. Now that's a mouthful, and that's a lot to chew on, so we're going to take each one a step at a time. First of all, values. Throughout Christian history, there have been certain values which have had a place in the public square that Christians have championed. Now, this is what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that Christians haven't had different opinions about these values. And it doesn't mean that one value is not more important than another value. Nor does it mean that Christians have always been good at living these values out for many reasons. But for the most part, Christians have followed Jesus' teachings on meeting the needs of the poor. When the Apostle Paul was sent out to reach the Gentiles with the message of Jesus, he was sent out with one condition by the leaders of the church at the time. And they said, you must also meet the needs of the poor. And the apostle said, that was one of the things that I was most eager to do anyways, meeting the needs of the poor. Advocating for life in the womb. John the Baptist, in some of the early pages of the Gospels, while he was in his mother's womb, leaped for joy, the Bible tells us, when he encountered Jesus, who was also in the womb of Mary, showing and suggesting this personhood and this value in the very womb. Propagating peace and nonviolence. And Jesus taught us not to retaliate. And if you remember, for those of you who remember the story, he commanded Peter when he pulled out his sword at the passion scene, he commanded him to withdraw, to hold back because of his love for peace. Following the rule of law when it's not in conflict with the gospel. A much older Peter and an apostle Paul, both of them encouraged a positive relationship with government whenever possible. Humanizing and taking care of the strangers in our midst. One of Jesus' most beautiful stories, the parable of the Good Samaritan, illustrates this love for a stranger, no matter who that stranger is. Empowering to work those who are able to work. The Apostle Paul warned his disciple Timothy to make sure that everyone in the Christian community were carrying their own load and were working. It's also true that as the population of the world has increased and as we have faced new challenges, that Christians have revisited the scriptures and put more energy and values that maybe they didn't earlier on because of the new challenges that they have faced into modernity. For example, Christians have revisited the scriptures and embraced religious freedom throughout the existence of Christianity, but maybe with a heightened sense of awareness during the colonization of America and the foundation of the United States. Once history broke into the Industrial Revolution and we started to face the problems of air pollution, Christians invested more energy in the environment than they had in previous decades because of the problems that were relevant at the time. These are all important values. And just in case you're wondering, I tried my best to pick an equal number of values that tend to be associated with the Democratic Party and that tend to be associated with the Republican Party. Now, just in case you're thinking, yeah, but Pastor John, I'm going to try to beat you to some of those buts, okay? And we'll go to our second point, approach. And while we're doing that, well, that was a great bumper. Should we watch that again? Okay, approach. Just because a party identifies itself with those values or any of those values doesn't mean that they have sole ownership over those values. And different parties sometimes offer different solutions and different approaches to these challenging topics. Now, take, for instance, the environment. While there are diverse views and diverse approaches on the environment, Christians who tend to lean left often feel like the dangers of global warming are so imminent that radical action needs to be taken now. On the other hand, Christians who may lean towards the right, many who also recognize that global warming is a reality, are skeptical about some of the solutions being offered and whether they're going to offer practical solutions and whether some of the solutions being offered are going to harm especially those in the third world country who tend to be the propagators of the most pollution today and also don't have a sure economic footing to go forward. And so that's just one example where there is similar values but different solutions to the problem. So some Christians have the same values but propose different fixes. Other Christians with the same values assess voting or political affiliation based on the majority of values that a party or a political figure represents. They look at the entire palette to determine which candidate or which platform best accomplishes those values the most. And then still, other Christians elevate one or two values above the others, arguing that, hey, if the house is burning down, usually you pick one or two of the most important things and get them out of the house. And then there are many here many here, when they look at political parties and political affiliation, and when they look at the election, they don't look at party affiliation as something they get excited about, but they vote in a way that they feel is going to bring about the least amount of damage to the country. Now, we don't like to be known for what we're against. At the same time, there's a protective spirit in them, and there's a protective spirit there, and that protective spirit can be good. Speaking of voting for a person, Christians throughout the centuries have also rightly pointed to the importance of character when voting for somebody in an election. The Bible is chock full of stories of communities that suffered because leaders failed. Shouldn't character of even non-religious leaders matter too? Some people might counter, well, forgiveness for past failures is important. While others might say that poor character can often be hidden. Some might say that values are more important than character, and then others might rebut that and say, how can you really separate values from character in the first place? Well, character is important, not just for Christians, but for the good of everyone. But there's no perfect candidate, and Christians often find themselves with a candidate that better supports their values and what they approve, while also not entirely reflecting the character that they strive for. So that can get muddied. And lastly, strategy. There are well-intended Christians that weigh strategy, which sounds a lot like approach, but I needed a different word because this is addressing a different question. Most Christians believe that not all of their values should be enshrined into public policy, but that leaves the question, which ones? Which ones? If you haven't noticed, both Christians who lean progressive and Christians who lean conservative quote the Bible to support their values. Both of them do that, and they pick the values that kind of align with their viewpoint. This has caused some to embrace a little bit more of an independent approach. And people who fall into this category might point to Paul's question in his letter to the Corinthians. What business is it of mine to judge those outside of the church? They might also point to Jesus, who welcomed a pro-government tax collector and an anti-government zealot to sit at the table and be among his disciples. They might also remind us of the only time that Jesus ever rebuked a public figure is when he called Herod a fox, and not the good kind of fox, mind you, because Herod was telling him to stop doing the good that he was doing. But other Christians push back against that more libertarian approach and say, unlike the disciples during the time of Jesus, the disciples, they weren't granted the opportunity to elect people, and there are certain responsibilities exercised that, when exercised wisely, are good for the world that citizens have here that they may not have had then. Now, chances are most of you are settled in some of your political thoughts, and perhaps you've already put in your mail-in vote. Nevertheless, when we lay all of these different political ideas out, we can see that putting them together can be a lot to process for people, and that's kind of the point. Because chances are you are sitting next to someone who thinks a little bit different than you. And we all know that they're wrong. But even if they are, if we are unable to humanize them, and if we don't, at the very least, create space to understand how they are processing these questions and give them the benefit of the doubt to people who are sincerely trying to follow Jesus' directions, then we won't achieve that place of compassion, and we won't be able to walk alongside of them. If we stay, on the other hand, if we stay with people on that journey, and if our hearts are willing to stay on that journey too, perhaps we won't harden our hearts when God is trying to do something new by pointing us back to what's ancient and true. So the first step to build a better politic is to weigh our political thoughts. And for some of us here, that might change our thinking. For others of us here, that might reaffirm what we already think and hold true. And still others, for some of us, we're still going to have questions. But by pressing into these biblical values together, we'll at least give ourselves the chance to be the better kind of people these values point to and hold arms with others on the same way. The second step is this: seize our political fears. Seize our political fears. Chances are, if you've watched any of the national debates around the presidential, vice presidential election, and maybe some of the lower level debates as well, you've noticed a tactic that has stood out in these debates. And that tactic is not so much to emphasize and promote your great policies and how your great thinking is going to change the country. It's more to show how your opponent is basically going to ruin the whole thing. And you know what? I don't know about you, but that's kind of annoying, and it's kind of taxing. And maybe part of that explains why 72% of Americans are just anxious about this whole thing. But there's a reason they do that. There's an important reason that they do that, because it works. It works. If you've watched a political ad from the other side, chances are it hasn't worked on you, but that is not directed toward you. It's directed towards the base. And one of the best tools to galvanize a base into political action is fear. And we don't like to talk about that, which is why what I'm about to say might sound surprising. Fear is not a bad thing. Fear is not a bad thing. That became clear, of all places, in a Bible lecture that I attended over the book of Revelation. Now, if you haven't had much exposure to the last book of the Bible, chances are you're still familiar with it by reputation and how scary it is, right? And how much fear it induces. Now, there's really no way to beat around the bush. There are some things in this book that invoke fear. At the same time, it's important to remember that this book is not written towards people who don't believe. It's written towards insiders. It's written towards the church to motivate and galvanize the church, who at times was lethargic, into action. At its heart, fear is being confronted with the possibility of loss. And fear can be good when it taps into something that's important to us. If I see my kids getting too close to the lake or too close to the river, there's something that jumps up in me that moves me to action, that either runs towards them to pull them away or yells at them with that big booming dad voice to create some boundaries. Fear in that context, it's a good thing. Or if there's some health concern around something that I'm eating or I'm drinking, fear can cause me to either take that in and measure doses, or it can cause me to not eat or drink that thing altogether. We all have these protective parts in us that are activated when something valuable to us is put at risk. And today there are a lot of red-blooded Americans who believe that something important is at risk. Now, let's look at the other side. Fear can be manipulated. And we need to know that because our emotions can be used against us. We can fear too much, and that can be a detriment to us in our lives. Have you ever heard of helicopter parents? If you are one, I love you. But being too protective can not only be harmful to you, but to the people that you love. Or have you ever suffered from anxiety that just seems to be an all-consuming thing? Fear can be consuming also. And lastly, we can fear the wrong things. We can fear the wrong things. But if we at least recognize our fears, and if we seize them and put them in front of us so that we can let our emotions see the light of day, we can better grasp what our core values really are, whether we realize them or not. We can get a sense of what really drives us. And we can also get a sense of maybe how people are influencing us, both to the positive and to the negative. If we know our political fears, we can be informed by our political fears without having to be controlled by our political fears. And that brings us to our last and most important way that we can build a better politic today, regardless of tomorrow's election. We can center our political hopes. Center our political hopes. It was early morning around Passover when the governor was annoyed to receive some unexpected visitors at his door. The Jewish leaders had come to the palace to request Pilate's company outside. And normally they would have gone inside, but they didn't want to have an encounter with him because of Jewish customs and become unclean because an important festival was coming up. So he was annoyed to have to, go all the way out there himself. Maybe he was still in his bathrobe. I don't know. I imagine that he muttered something under his breath as he was on his way out, though. But perhaps Pilate was surprised to see a man tied up with them. This was the guy that all the rumors were about, that reportedly done some miracles and some kind of itinerant preacher. This was the man that they called Jesus. But Pilate wasn't that interested. Deal with it yourself, he basically said. And the Jews were like, no, he's a criminal. Judge him by your own law. He really wanted to get back to his breakfast. But we can't execute anybody. Execute? Now this looked like it was starting to get out of hand. Well, sometime between this little exchange that Pilate had with the Jews, Pilate learned the charge that Jesus claimed to be King of the Jews. some kind of a local ruler, somebody who had authority over this ethnic people in this land, something like that. But he really wasn't that interested in it. And he did engage Jesus, though, and Jesus seemed really to be more like a philosopher than he did somebody who was a military leader who posed a threat to the Roman Empire. So after a short dialogue with Jesus, he really wanted to take him back, but he did get Jesus to say something, and Jesus used the words in his conversation with Pilate, "My kingdom." You could almost hear a chuckle in Pilate's report when he says, "You are a king then, huh?" I imagine him shoving a handful of breakfast in his mouth and grabbing Jesus and going back out to the Jews there to try to give him back to them so that they would deal with him. But the Jews still wouldn't take him. Pilate was mad. He had Jesus flogged. He dressed him up as a fool with a crown of thorns. He figured maybe this will satisfy them so that they'll leave me alone and this won't become a problem for me in an already tense time. The Jews then say something to Pilate that changes the entire scene. But before we go there, I want to do a quick Greek lesson on something that I never thought I would, and that's the word "the." The word "the." We're going to talk about the word "the" in a political sermon, of all things. Well, as simple as that word is, in English it can have multiple shades, multiple meanings. It can be used for specificity. I met the Tom Brady. Not just any Tom Brady, I met the Tom Brady. Or uniqueness. We don't say, "Oh, look, a moon." We say, "Oh, the moon, the moon." It can also be used for reference. Can you pass the salt? The salt. It can be used, a lot of more ways, but another example is it can be used for something that's the best of kind. Oh, they aren't just any doctor there of Boston. They are the doctor of Boston. Well, in Greek, the word for "the" is really one letter in the masculine. It's an omicron, which is like our English O, with a breathing mark above it, and it's pronounced "ha," which is kind of funny. Yeah, we'll get there. All right. Well, okay, so "ha," the, it can also be used in various ways. It can be used as a simple reference to something. In the original language of the New Testament, it can also be used. It can also be used as a best of kind, like the doctor illustration, the doctor. And then sometimes it can just simply be untranslated, which might be a little weird to us, but sometimes when we see that article, the there in the original language, you see an A there. I just want you to hold on to that because that's going to be important in a second. After Pilate was rejected, here's how he responds. Or here's how after Pilate brought Jesus back, here's how the Jews respond. "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." Now, Pilate didn't have a concept for what Trinity was as we think of it, or what the deity of Jesus could be. He lived in a Roman world with many gods, but it wasn't quite the same thing. So what was he thinking when he heard that expression, Son of God? Well, it turns out that expression was used in the Roman world to refer to the most powerful figure underneath Zeus. And who was that in the Roman world but Caesar? And why was that a problem? Because Caesar was his boss. And anybody who claimed to be the Son of God was saying, "Hey, I'm really your boss." And that's not good because he would get in trouble with Caesar for something called sedition. You can just feel his exasperation at this point. So Pilate, when he heard this, he was even more afraid. And he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize that I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." And from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." Now, this is a good place to stop, and let's focus on that last statement, a king. If we can throw that verse up again. A king, because that's one of those instances where you have the Greek article, and this is a perfectly fine way to translate this, but given the context, he's probably not just talking about a king, he's probably talking about the king. The king. Par excellence, best of its kind, highest of class. Anyone who claims to be the king opposes Caesar. And because of that, you have to execute him. You see this game happening between the Jews and Pilate? Well, you know the rest of the story. But let's not miss the heart of the story. A Roman governor who was appointed by a man that was believed to be the most important and powerful person in the world was putting to death a man who was actually that. At the foot of the cross, Jesus tells Pilate, "You would have no power if it were not given to you from above." Well, one of the things that I appreciated about Pastor Brian, who was the former senior pastor at Grace Chapel, was he gave a lot of detailed attention to a political sermon. And he would go through his manuscript and he would count the number of times that there was references that might be taken to be a Republican lean, and then he would do the same for a Democrat lean, and then he would make sure the numbers were even. And he would even, I don't know if you noticed this, but he would even always wear a purple shirt on those Sundays because he didn't want to come across as not appearing uneven-handed. He wanted to come across as appearing even-handed on these controversial days. I wore green today. But I did it intentionally because as valuable as I think that is, I think that there is something to say about the church in the midst of all of this. The church is not a political party. It cannot be bent by any one political party. One pastor put it this way: it is altogether a different species of thing. Its ambitions are higher. Its game is longer. Its weapons are spiritual and better. Its office holder, it's eternal. I was driving down Main Street in Nashua, and I noticed a beautiful building to my left that had prominent big 3D letters printed across the top of it, saying something like the offices of U.S. Senate. And what stood out to me was that it actually had the name of the U.S. Senator, and I was thinking, well, that's a lot of work to put all of that up there. I must have been at a parking light because that just captured my attention. And before the light turned green, I took a quick look up at it again, and then I noticed something. There was the stain of previous letters behind the name of that senator. I could see it, not long enough to make out the name of who that senator was, but long enough to notice that there was another name there before. And the name, it really doesn't matter who it was. That's not important. What the point was clear, though. Someone else held that seat before, and someone will hold that seat afterwards. Jesus never loses an election, and no one replaces him on the throne. I get it. Jesus is not running on November 5th. And chances are, if he was on the ballot, maybe he's someone that we would vote for, right? We would like to vote for. But whoever is on the ballot and whoever is elected on November 5th, Jesus is still on the throne. He is still on the throne. He has power to use a candidate. He has power to change a candidate, and he has. He has power to repurpose the poor decisions of a candidate, and he has power to even repurpose the bad intentions of a leader for good. That doesn't mean that what is coming is going to be easy. I want to make that clear. In fact, easy may not be what God wants for us in the next season. But if we are intent on building his kingdom, we can attack what is not easy and make the most of the new opportunities where others will run and hide. To say that Jesus is king is perhaps the most political thing that anyone could ever say. It's just not the normal way we think about politics, because God is doing something bigger. He is building something stronger. And while our national and local political actions do matter now, our greatest fear should be missing out on the politics of his kingdom, because his politics combine real love and true power, and it offers something that lasts. We can build God's kingdom regardless of tomorrow's republic, because Jesus is on the throne today. So, what are some specific things that we can do to prepare ourselves to be people who live a life on November 6th? I don't know about you, but for me, sometimes there is one or two issues that I really don't like to hear the perspective on the other side. It's just, I get tired of it. It's taxing. I try, but it's difficult. And I sometimes would prefer to go to my political comfort food and hear the ideas that I already believe. But I was reminded recently of just how important that is, not because I'm going to change on some of those issues, but because it really helps me to humanize and build a connection with these people by understanding their fears, whether I think their fears are legitimate or right. It helps me to build a connection with them that may not sway the needle, but that connecting is kingdom work. Building those connections is kingdom work. It's not only kingdom work, and it's not the end of kingdom work, but it's a starting place for kingdom work. So, one of the things that we can do to prepare is listen to the fears of others to connect with them. Listen to the fears of other people on the other side to connect with them. Second, pray. Pray for your candidates. Pray for their candidates. The Bible strongly suggests that when we pray, we can grow in our compassion and we can grow in our empathy, even for the people that we don't like. But I think that there's something more. When we pray, it helps us to develop a divine vision for God's control and his power. How could we see God at work in this situation? How can I trust God in bigger ways in this scenario that I never really wanted to happen? Imagine yourself saying, God, this isn't what I prayed for, but I trust you're going to do something interesting and good with this situation. At the very least, I trust that you're going to stretch me. Third, weep and work. Weep and work. I know that category is kind of cheating because I put two together, but one's going to flow into the other. The world is broken. The election will not fix it. And it's hard to stay emotionally connected in the middle of the brokenness. It's also wrong to let our hearts become callous in the middle of the brokenness. So let's weep and let's let our tears turn into action. Some of the earliest Christians, first, throughout history, when government has been broken, the church has stepped in. Throughout history, the church has done this, as imperfect as she can sometimes be. And in its early years, it was common for unwanted infants with deformities and disabilities to be just cast aside in something that was called exposure in the Roman world. They were just thrown into ditches, basically. And the early Christians responded by rescuing and raising these infants as their own. Now I know that can feel a little overwhelming for us. But what is something small that we can do? What are small ways that we can participate in this good and beautiful work that God has laid out for us? Well, these are difficult times. It's challenging for the church. And I know a sermon like this one does not cover all of the issues. It's not a sermon that's answering all the questions. And that would take a lot of time. And I don't know that I could even answer them all. At the same time, we don't have to abandon hope as we wrestle, as we know our fears, and as we lean into Jesus during this season. During the hard times, this is something that the church has always done. And until he comes again, that is something that the church will continue to do. Let's pray.